Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, on this week's episode of Afternoon Light, I am joined by Keith Wolahan, who is the federal member for the seat of Menzies. But prior to entering the federal parliament in 2022, Keith was a barrister, but also served in the Australian Army and in Timor-Leste and in Afghanistan, and he completed his military career being decorated with a Commendation for Distinguished Service for Performance of Duty in Action as a platoon commander. So, Keith, it is wonderful to have you here on Afternoon Light and here at the Robert Menzies Institute.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon or morning to your listeners.
Well, Keith, today we are recording on the 26th of April, so the day after ANZAC Day, and we actually have you here at the Institute to give an address on the Korean War, because this year, 2023, is the 70th anniversary of the armistice that was struck in Korea after the 3 years fighting in the Korean War. And we are really looking forward to hearing your address tonight on that topic and really what it means for Australia to this very day. But I thought, given you would have been to many local ANZAC Day commemorations yesterday in your electorate, and given you've served in the Australian Army, it'd be interesting to hear what ANZAC Day means to you.
No, thank you, Georgina. And actually, on my way here, I was prompted by a Twitter reminder that this date is also the anniversary of Robert Menzies getting sworn in for his first term as Prime Minister. It was on the 26th of April.
Indeed.
Assuming Twitter hasn't led me astray.
We've also marked that on our website and social media, so it's accurate.
Good. No, in fact, it was probably you that prompted me. Gathering the day after ANZAC Day, it used to be on ANZAC Day, it was a day where I'd gather with my friends. And for a lot of veterans, that's the most important part, because often when you're gathering with your friends, some are missing and some been killed in action, but others have had issues that they're dealing with afterwards. But since being elected as a member of parliament, it's important to be in the community. So I was lucky enough to attend 3 services in Doncaster, Templestowe and then Warrandyte. And I was blown away by the turnout when so many people gather in the cold, in the dark. It gives you a sense of comfort that people do remember and that Australians are grateful. So it was really quite a special feeling to be there yesterday. I think this particular ANZAC Day stood out because something happened last Saturday that I think is momentous in terms of our military history. Of the 103,000 names on the War Memorial, there are many that the families had no idea how they died. And when they got the telegram, it simply said, "Known unto God." And 81 years ago, 1,000 Australian prisoners of war in Papua New Guinea were put on a Japanese merchant ship, the Montevideo Maru. And only last Saturday, Australian scientists located that wreckage, twice the depth of the Titanic, at 4 kilometres deep. And in my address, I reflected on their last moments and what they thought of, because 1,000, that's hard to comprehend. That's double the casualties in Vietnam. And it all happened in 11 minutes. So I often think about what were their last thoughts of home. And it was important that we remember them yesterday.
Absolutely. Well, an extraordinary effort to find the Maru after 81 years. And if there's any consolation, at least there might be some small consolation to the families of those who were lost there, that they now know the final resting place. But yes, a reminder that war doesn't end on the day the truce is signed or there's an agreement to surrender, that it lives with us for decades later. For you, commemorating ANZAC Day with friends, and you said either friends who are missing or friends who are there who are suffering, do you feel like ANZAC Day has changed throughout your lifetime here in Australia? From my perspective, it's become a much bigger commemoration than when I was a child. I feel like up to the lead up to the centenary of Gallipoli and then beyond, we as a nation have coalesced around ANZAC Day as sort of a national day of togetherness, of acknowledgement of Australia as a nation that stands for a lot of good things, but a nation that's put a lot on the line to preserve what's good and true.
I think it has, and I migrated to Australia from Ireland in 1988. And
still detect a
tiny
bit.
Yeah,
I bet you can put it on well.
I think there was, sometimes I get heckled in Parliament for a question if I pronounce a word, but I've got a thick skin.
I have an affection for the Irish, a newfound affection for the Irish now, Keith, because I have a sister-in-law of just over a year who is Irish.
Oh, wow.
Yes, yeah.
When I think back to when I first learnt about Anzac Day, unlike you've got a significant military history in your family. I didn't. And it was something foreign to me. I didn't know what it was. And I remember the teachers would talk about various texts and books that questioned about whether Anzac Day was about glorifying war. And we quickly realised it wasn't. It's not a military parade of tanks through the streets. It is a solemn reflection of sacrifice. And including that example of the Montevideo Maru, that's not about battles and war. That's about a horrible scenario of where men imprisoned below deck heard an explosion and the water rushed in. And it was sunk by a United States submarine, and that's what the fog of war does, that they didn't know who was on board. But war is chaotic and violent and has a lasting impact. And when you think of those numbers, 61,000 killed in World War I, Australia's population wasn't that big. So there would be very few families that weren't touched by it. Same in World War II, 39,500 killed. Very few families not touched by that. And so Anzac Day was a way to give some comfort to the families, to say that you're not alone and we are grateful for what happened. And so as the sun comes up, we reflect upon the sacrifice. But I think later in the day, I think it's a chance for us to commit to living in a nation that's worth fighting for. And that's an important thing to do. It's not just about remembering sacrifice, but remembering what they left behind. Because again, like those men on that ship, their last thought other than their family would have been of home and affection for home, and we should honour that.
Of course, yes. It was interesting, we were talking about this before. I was in Taiwan last week, which is a country that, every day faces an existential threat, much like, I guess, Ukraine was until February last year when it became the reality. We were talking about that will to fight, the will of the local population to fight to the death, really to be prepared to put everything on the line for their freedom. And it was a quip, perhaps, not particularly well thought through by one of our interlocutors who said, Australia, you go to war for other countries, you don't have to fight your own wars on your own territory. Like, we've faced that prospect. They were grateful that we did that, but they were a bit puzzled. And we were trying to explain to them that, a lot of the military engagements Australia has been in do touch directly Australia's interests, especially the very historical ones. But also there is a point where your way of life and the democratic system that we live under and want to continue to live under is on the line in a lot of these military engagements. So it's not just about your particular piece of territory that you call home. It's about defending an order, a liberal order, or the opposing side is an authoritarian order. And that been the same for generations in Australia, that we have a preparedness to fight for our values.
We do. And then for those that are then deployed overseas, you fight for many other things, including for the person standing next to you. And there's a fear that is greater than the fear of death, really, which is the fear of letting your friends down. And no Australian wants to let their friends down. And that drives people to do extraordinary things. And I think it's deep in our psyche that we look after each other, and that's a beautiful thing.
Were you surprised by the bravery of your fellow men and women when you were in the battlefield? Or do you train enough that it just goes without saying?
They always surprised me, and I was a platoon commander, and platoon commanders, we get a lot of the credit for all of the good work that our soldiers do, and they're the ones that are first through the door or first to step on a footpath that might have an improvised explosive device. They're first to do everything, and we try to lead from the front, but they just don't let you because they're always out there themselves. Yes and no. I knew them so well from the training that we did and saw them display courage in the training and selection. So when it came time to do it for real, I wasn't surprised.
Yeah.
I guess what did surprise me was how young they were, that even in my 3 tours of Afghanistan, many of the soldiers who were there were children when September 11 happened. They were in primary school. So when we watched it on TV. They were tucked into bed at night. Yet here they were fighting that conflict that was a consequence of that.
So tonight, Keith, you're going to speak about the Korean War, which is sometimes called the Forgotten War. It doesn't have the long-lived reputation, I guess, of Vietnam, obviously of World War I or World War II. The casualties were a lot lower. Only 339 Australians were killed in action and 1,216 wounded. But what do you think is the significance to this day of the Korean War?
I think when you think of a tragedy, like any soldier dying, and any soldier dying is a tragedy, unfortunately, it gets caught up in the scale of the numbers involved. Yes. So for this war to occur just a few years after World War II, which had occurred itself just one generation after World War I think in the eyes of Australians, it didn't have the scale that they had become, unfortunately, accustomed to. I think also the way it ended mattered. It didn't end in a victory or a defeat. It ended in a stalemate. Yeah. So that changed their perception of it, that it wasn't like other wars they had become used to. Sadly, as we went through to Vietnam and then later to Iraq and Afghanistan, we realized that maybe that's the norm. Wars don't end in a victory or a defeat. And then finally, I think it mattered that this war happened before movies and TV were able to tell people about a war. So I grew up in the 1980s watching a lot of Vietnam War movies. And even when I saw MASH on TV, I thought that was about Vietnam. It was only later my dad told me, actually, that was about Korea.
Actually, I didn't know that.
Yeah, most people don't. Most people think MASH is about Vietnam, but it's actually it's about Korea.
About Korea, right.
Yeah. So it didn't have the coverage in Hollywood like World War II and Vietnam happened. And I think Hollywood gets to shape our perceptions of a conflict as well.
Yes, indeed. And as you say, that it's the scale. So every single Australian knows someone who died in the Korean War or who served in the Korean War. There was no conscription for the Korean War. That came later in 1963, if I get my dates right. But this was not necessarily a war that was played out on daily news as much as the previous conflicts had been. And maybe there was a battle weariness too. God, another war we're involved in overseas. Australia's entry into the Korean War is quite an extraordinary story. In terms of Menzies' leadership, maybe it's sort of all a little bit untidy, one could say. Can you describe that to me?
That's right. I think for your listeners who aren't aware how we came into war, the circumstances could never have happened in today's modern communication world.
No, definitely not.
So at the time, it all happened quite quickly. So as the North invaded the South, the United Nations Security Council had two critical resolutions over 2 days. And it's important to note that the Soviet Union was absent. They were boycotting it at the time. And as the United States led a coalition of the willing, Menzies was at first reluctant to commit and committed forces short of ground troops. And his external affairs minister had a different view. Percy Spender, who's a very famous surname in Australian politics.
Yes.
His granddaughter is the current member for Wentworth. And he thought that this was an opportunity for Australia to move closer to the United States. But Robert Menzies, his heart pulled him more to the United Kingdom. And his view was that unless the United Kingdom is in, we're not. So he put one foot in but didn't want to put the other. But then when he was on a ship heading away and he was not the Prime Minister, the acting Prime Minister was in the chair, Percy Spender saw his chance. And so with Menzies away, they made the decision to commit ground troops. Now, Robert Menzies, I'm sure, was really happy about that. But in the end, he owned it and he accepted it and ran with it. So I don't think these days you would ever find an acting Prime Minister making such an important decision like that while the Prime Minister is away or out of Wi-Fi range.
No, well, and as you say, these days with technology the way it is, there would be no circumstance. Well, we say no circumstance, but, maybe satellites are down and comms are jammed. Maybe there will be a circumstance in the future. But it's hard to imagine a circumstance where the Prime Minister is incommunicado for such a period of time as they are not able to make a decision about whether to commit ground troops to a war or not. But as you say, suffice to say, Menzies owned it, although there is some biographical details around, I think it was Arthur Fadden, who was acting Prime Minister at the time. He informed Menzies of the decision that there was a sourness in Menzies' voice and he responded, but that is no doubt understandable. So we do commit ground troops to the Korean War, and in the end there was that sense, well, Britain was committing them, so we should commit them. And actually, we got in just, I think, an hour or so before Britain in terms of our public announcement. But it contributed to a strategic reason for Australia as well, because we were in the process of negotiating the ANZAC alliance with the United States, and that would have given us another impetus to encourage the United States to sign the treaty with Australia. So there was some realpolitik around the reasons for committing ground troops, not just because it was the right thing to do.
That's right. And I think that is, if you were to look at the legacies of the Korean War from an Australian perspective, that ranks number one, that it had a key role in the ANZUS agreement. And we know that because it's recognised as such. And in fact, here in this museum, you showed me a note from Truman to Menzies, I think from 1956. It was his memoirs. And he notes the commitment of Australia to global peace. And that can only be a reference to Korea. And we know that from other supporting documents, that it was a key reason for the United States to commit to ANZUS. Because in the end, whether you're a nation or an individual or a company, we're all judged by what we do, not what we say. And if we're to sign a bit of paper that says we will be there to help you, well, here is a test of that. And it was either step up or step aside.
Yes. And look, and ANZUS went through, the relationship with the United States under ANZUS was never really as clear as it is today. It's quite interesting to note that in the 1960s, President Kennedy, when talking to Menzies about konfrontasi with Indonesia, said, given US commercial interests in Indonesia, that ANZUS wouldn't apply if Indonesia launched an attack against the Australian mainland. Which is hard to imagine in this day and age under the current ANZUS relationship. You just couldn't imagine that conversation would even take place. But it wasn't a relationship that has evolved over time and under different presidents too.
I think if Joe Hockey was having golf with Robert Kennedy, it would have been fine. So,
oh, well, there
that was the difference.
Maybe it's the ambassador who makes the
Sorry,
difference.
John Kennedy.
You mentioned before the United Nations Security Council, which of course was quite new at that stage in 1950, and that the USSR was boycotting the Security Council. I think what's interesting too is that China today is a permanent member of the Security Council, so it gets a veto right over any decisions of the Security Council. But at that stage in 1950, it was actually Republic of China,
That's
which
right.
I just visited, Taiwan, who was in the seat of China, and they did not veto the decision to send a UN-backed force into Korea, which also just shows the changing dynamics of the Security Council and the membership of it, and the way the permanent members interact is really just an example of geopolitics as it is. And these days, with Russia, no longer the USSR, of course, Russia and the PRC, China, as permanent members of the Security Council, along with the United States, France and the UK, it's pretty much at a standoff when it comes to major decisions around international peace and security. I mean, is it fit for purpose?
It's a good question, and I guess it depends what the purpose is. So, as we all know, the United Nations rose like a phoenix from the ashes from the League of Nations, and the Great Compromise was a recognition of realpolitics, that not all nations are equal, and some do have more power than others. If its purpose is in the aftermath of World War II to stop total war, then I think you can say the results are successful. You could say that. If its purpose is to stop war more broadly, then there's a question mark over it. What it could be replaced with that still recognises that tension of a global interest in peace and order, but a recognition that some have interests and power that are not equal. I don't know what else you could replace that with. I think the purpose of avoiding total war has to be number one. And because its record, maybe by coincidence, is a good one in that respect, I think any other reform of the Security Council would proceed with caution, I would say.
I mean, there's been discussions around expanding the permanent membership to include countries that are of more significance now than they were in the 1940s when the UN was created. So, for example, India is not a permanent member. Japan is not a permanent member. Would it not be more appropriate that those countries are given a seat rather than France? As Australians, we're always a bit sceptical of the French. Are they very reliable?
Look, that is a good point, because if the great compromise is to be recognised, then it should move over time as powers grow or wane. And no doubt on the measures that were applied when it was formed, India should be there.
Yeah.
Should be. There's a good argument for Germany to be there now, but obviously the history of how and why it was formed is very relevant.
Yes, and of course Japan would have not been appropriate at all acceptable in the late 1940s.
So I think in the end, reform would be a good idea, but it would require a consensus from those that are already there. And for those that have power, diluting it is usually a tough sell. So it depends upon the leaders of the particular nations at a particular time. But if all the holes in the cheese aligned in future decades, that could happen, then I think it should.
You served in Timor-Leste, East Timor as it used to be known. That was a UN-led mission, Interfet. I mean, do those missions work well in your view? I mean, is it not a sense of... Is there a clear command structure when it's a UN-led mission or...
Well, when I went in 2007, it wasn't as part of the UN. I was part of an Australian task force, but I obviously reflected upon what that was like. I was a student here at Melbourne University when Interfet happened, and I remember reading it in the papers, glued to it. I think that is a success story for the UN, the intervention, and a success story for Australia and the decisions made by the Howard government at the time. But that doesn't mean they're successful all the time. Again, United Nations-led missions, again, they are a compromise. So you're dealing with competing interests, different layers of bureaucracy, potentially different layers of corruption. So each has to be judged on its merits. But sometimes if there's a particular mission, some countries are better suited to leading that than others, whether it's a language skill or a cultural background. That's very important. But yeah, I'd judge each on its merits, but the Timor intervention, I think it was a successful one.
On Korea, it was a 3-year conflict. I mean, it's still ongoing in a way. It was just a truce that was signed in 1953. They didn't resolve anything in particular. The North Korea still poses a threat to South Korea. We were just talking before about how easily Seoul could be taken out just by artillery fire from North Korea. So this is something that the South Koreans live with on a daily basis. But as a UN-led mission, North and South Korea in 1950 was split at the 38th parallel. When they signed the truce 3 years later, the border was unchanged, basically. So was it a success or?
Well, it's a very relevant question, not just for Korea, but another conflict that was close to my heart, which was Afghanistan, which finished very much like it started. And so it feel like we've watched this movie before. And in between the start and the end is enormous sacrifice and loss. And what's often lost in the Korean War, whilst Australian casualties were relatively low, the casualties on the United States were more than 35,000. And for Koreans, the civilian casualties were 3 million. Because even though it ended where it started, either side took, lost and regained terrain and cities again and again. And each time that happened, there was massive destruction, there was massacres. So as a proportion of the population, the civilian casualties in Korea were higher than World War II or Vietnam. So for the people of Korea, this was a devastating conflict. So for it to end up where it started, I think we're entitled to ask questions as to how it was conducted, including, whilst he's an icon and a hero in US military history, some of the decisions of General MacArthur to go beyond his remit and to then draw China back into the war.
Yes. But
you're right to note that it hasn't ended. And I had a personal experience of that where when I was still in uniform, I was deployed to South Korea for the longest running exercise, I think, in the world. It changes its name, but it's called Exercise Ulchi Freedom. And it's a combined United States and South Korean exercise that is designed to prevent war and deal with a potential conflict. The North Koreans say it's an exercise to prepare for war, and so the propaganda goes. But to do that exercise, to read all of the operational plans for what might happen, you realise that this thing didn't end, and it hasn't ended for the people of South Korea either, or North Korea.
Indeed. Keith, on the issue of concerns around US escalation in the Korean War, that was something Menzies was concerned about. And in fact, There's information in official documents that Menzies and his External Affairs Minister, Percy Spender, actually contemplated recognising the PRC, so People's Republic of China, during this time over Republic of China as officially the Chinese government, to try and de-escalate the tensions with China, because such were their concerns about the US activities in Korea, and of course that related to General MacArthur. In terms of what the Korean War left us as a legacy, it is important to note that President Truman did refuse General MacArthur's request to use nuclear weapons in Korea, which would have been quite a plausible option given they had just used them in Japan only a few years earlier in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That, I think, can only be a positive legacy, that there was a red line drawn by the president, by the administration, that they shouldn't. But these concerns Australia had about US management of a war, I mean, it's obviously, having served alongside US forces, it's probably a bit sensitive for you to comment. But as a general reflection, how do you find that as an Australian dealing under the command of another power?
One of the many lessons I took from my time in Afghanistan was the imperfection by the military to solve certain problems. So there's things that the military is very good at, and it's fighting wars. But that doesn't always translate into good strategy. And in the end, strategy is on policymakers, on elected officials for democracies. And sometimes they have to push back on the military, and sometimes they didn't do a good job of that. I think the decision by Truman to push back was a really good one. And for Menzies to contemplate those sort of decisions, he was right to ask the questions. For your listeners who might not be aware, one of the things that happened in the Korean War was that General MacArthur's successors sort of got a bit out of control. He pushed the North Korean forces back north, but just kept pushing them. And he pushed them right up into this river called the Yalu River. And this proved to be a tactical success, but a strategic disaster. And it was a strategic disaster because it prompted and provoked China to enter the conflict. And at the time, the Western public in the United States, and including here in Australia, was disillusioned with the conflict. It had been dragging on. And to now suddenly have China enter it, people were contemplating great power conflict again.
Yeah.
And I think that's an example of where it's incumbent upon leaders of countries, civilian leaders, to exercise control over how a war is conducted.
Did MacArthur go beyond his brief, taking the troops up to the Yalu River? Or was this all part of the permitted actions of a general in the battle?
I'd probably need to do more homework on it, but I think his brief was to push them back, and, he kept running, he kept going.
Right.
But I think when all of these briefs, there are some implied directions that people should consider. Even in the exercise that I was engaged with, there were absolute, if there was a requirement to counter an invasion, there were absolute red lines around borders, because borders are so important.
Yes.
And in Afghanistan, there was too. There were some missions that were conducted that were on the border with Pakistan, and there was a zone you couldn't cross, because in war, human error is a given. And again, that example of the Australian prisoners of war was human error. Human error is the cause of 90% of civilian casualties for Iraq and Afghanistan. So if we can reduce human error by first accepting that it happens, but then putting controls around it, I think wars can be less destructive.
Well, we may not have to worry about human error in the future if the doomsayers around AI-run warfare are correct, that it'll all just be an algorithm that will decide who's a legitimate target and who's not. It's quite a frightening concept. But
yes, and then the scary thing,
the algorithm's more correct, or
but is the human error in the algorithm that's
or is it the human
that's
error
the
in
ultimate
the
worry?
Yes, yeah. The Battle of Kapyong is worth reflecting on, and of course this is where Australia, is it the only time Australian troops have fought directly against Chinese troops? It might be.
That might be right.
And it was quite an extraordinary battle considering the numbers. And I mean, you've been in active combat, you would know how important an asymmetry of troops is. You always want to be on the larger side than the lesser side. But I mean, the Australian battalion of only about 800 soldiers faced an entire Chinese division of 15,000 men.
It's a significant...
And won.
Yeah, that's right. It's an amazing moment in Australian military history. The battalion that was involved in is 3RAR, the Royal Australian Regiment. and they even have, there's a Kapyong Day that they mark. It's their most important day. I think it's as significant as the Battle of Long Tan in Vietnam, very similar ratios, and then that's for a 6 RAR. And again, for Australians to be outnumbered like that and to come through, it's an extraordinary thing, and says a lot about the professionalism and courage of the people that we sent there. Yeah, I think it's probably the most significant Australian battle of the war. There's another battle Marion's saying that's very important too.
So Australian troops are obviously well prepared, well trained, but there is some criticism by historians that Australia wasn't very well prepared to enter into the Korean War, and that might have been part of the reasons why Menzies was quite reticent to send ground troops. Do you think that's true?
That's certainly some of the reasons given, some of the accounts about why Menzies was nervous. It takes a long time for a military to pull through a conflict and reinvent itself.
Yeah.
We're still conducting that here after Afghanistan. You know, the Brereton Report is a part of that, looking at ourselves and reinventing ourselves after a significant conflict. But it takes time, it takes many years, and there's a lot of people after a big war they don't want anything to do with the military anymore when they get out. So you lose that corporate knowledge and you have to start afresh. But I think when you look at the senior leaders and even the tactical leaders in the ground troops, many of them were World War II veterans. But it's always a risk fighting the last war. But if you were to pick a war that was a last war, the best one probably was World War II. But yeah, you've got to be careful that the last war is not the one that dictates how you fight the next one. For example, whilst Timor wasn't a war in the normal sense, it was much more a peacekeeping operation. But those tactics, techniques didn't necessarily apply to Afghanistan, where you had a much higher improvised explosive devices threat. You couldn't use flat-hulled vehicles. You needed greater armour on the soldiers. You needed to project your weapons at a longer distance. Again, the terrain and enemy in Korea was quite different to what we'd faced before, and I don't think we were ready for that because it all happened quite quickly.
So speaking of quite quickly, feels like in 10 short years we've gone from a defence posture that saw low-level territorial incursions being from sort of middle powers, smaller middle powers being the main source of threat in Australia, to now defence strategists saying, well, we are on the precipice of being involved in a war with a great power, and we need to prepare for this, and we need to change the way our defence force is structured, what assets we procure in order to prepare. The Defence Strategic Review was just released on Monday. What are your preliminary thoughts of where the government is being recommended to go and what decisions are being taken? I know the Army is facing some cuts to things that they thought they could rely on.
So there's broad agreement between the two major parties, the government and the opposition, that we are in the most strategically dangerous period since World War II. Now, if you accept that as a fact, then the decisions that you make reflect how seriously you take that proposition. And there are things in the strategic review that we welcome, but there are also things that we're quite concerned about. It seems take resources being moved from one area of defence into another, and that's about making hard choices.
Yes.
The problem with making hard choices is you might get it wrong. And in defence, you still have to hedge. There is an important role for Army as well as the Navy and the Air Force. And there is, all the focus has been on the Navy with AUKUS, as it should be, but we will always need an Army. And there was a requirement to have 3 battalions fitted with infantry fighting vehicles, and that required 450 vehicles. That's now down to 129. So that's an immediate example of something being cut in one area to fund another. Now, we don't have an endless budget in this country to fund all things for all occasions, but there are many different areas you could find efficiencies in defence without cutting capability. And it seems that there has been some examples of where capability has been cut before inefficiencies have been cut.
If the worst came to the worst and Australia was engaged in a military confrontation with China, I mean, is this likely to be fought on Australian territory? I mean, I guess that's the question around investing heavily in the Army's assets, is would these be deployed on the Australian mainland? I mean, if things have got so bad that you have enemies invading the Australian territory and you're fighting battles on the Australian territory, that seems like game over, doesn't it? I mean, and this is a question from a military novice.
Sure. So wars are won or lost in the minds of one side before they happen. Mm-hmm. And so in my view, our purpose isn't to win wars. Our purpose is to win war games.
Yeah.
So when we acquire military equipment, build capability, form alliances, we're making the prospect of a war just that much harder so that the decision to engage in it doesn't occur. And so when we do things, we're thinking, what does that look like for someone contemplating or a nation contemplating an aggressive act? And a good example is Ukraine. So obviously there was a war game conducted by senior Russian political and military leaders about how that war would go. And it almost certainly didn't reflect what happened. I would like to think that the resilience and will to fight shown by Ukrainians is something that makes any other potential aggressor think twice about an aggressive act. And I often reflect that maybe the end of the Afghanistan war sent the opposite signal, that it sent a signal that in a war game, I think that fed into the war game for Russia about the will to fight by not only the nation of Afghanistan, but also the United States in supporting them. And I think that fed into the miscalculation. So in terms of the scenarios that we are thinking about, we are a piece of the war game puzzle, but it's something that has two sides to it. So you have to constantly evolve and move and think 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. But we have a role to play in that war game.
Of course. And as you say, a lot of this is about deterrence rather than the actual war, which you hope never ever eventuates. And I guess you're right. So the issue with Syria and President Obama saying there was a red line, and then when that was crossed, the US didn't do anything. The Ukraine response and their incredible will to fight, one hopes that acts as a deterrent for other actors considering similar sorts of invasions. But ultimately, we are incredibly reliant on our US ally, aren't we? And in the end is about what are they prepared to do, and as their domestic political situation evolves, that might change. We've seen evolutions of US posture and policy around, are they going to be more interventionist and care enough about what's going on in the rest of the world to enter into wars overseas, or are they going to withdraw in themselves and adopt another period of isolationism? And that's, of course, for Australia, quite a scary prospect.
And that's why treaties like ANZAC and AUKUS are so important. We're just constantly knocking on the door, reminding a larger power that it's our friend, that we're not only here to help when you need it, but you may need to help us. So that's in your interests, as you know from your time in DFAT, that in the end, nations will act in their own self-interest. So to make our interests aligned with their interests is our goal through all of these agreements. That doesn't come from the words on the page, doesn't come from fancy dinners or trips to embassies. It comes from being there when times are tough.
In terms of consideration about what's rational in your adversary's eyes? I mean, having been in Taiwan talking to counterparts there's a concern that what is rational in the US, in the Australian system, might not necessarily translate into other systems, and that mass casualties might be totally acceptable because the desire, for example, reunification of China is so great, and President Xi Jinping is so concerned about a legacy to deliver to the Chinese people, that the Xi Jinping legacy is reunification of China, come what may. I mean, how do you deal with that?
It's important, and I think other than in exceptional circumstances, you start from the proposition that all sides are rational actors, but that doesn't mean every individual.
Sounds a bit hopeful, doesn't it?
It does. It doesn't mean every individual and every circumstance is rational. It also requires some level of not perfect, but good information.
Yes.
And a concern with the decision cycle that's being made in Russia, that maybe the president is not being fed all of the information that is true, and he's being told what he wants to hear. Now, in Western democracies like ours, we've got professional public servants and accountable systems where that's unlikely to occur. But we are responsive to our own population, so we can't ignore that. That's a check on the decisions that are being made. But even in non-democracies, in totalitarian states, they still have one eye to their own populations, because if a future conflict was to go bad, there's a question about whether any authoritarian regime would survive that. I think another particular factor that's relevant for China is the the historical effect of the one-child policy, that many of the officer corps and members of the Defence Force come from one-child families. Now, if your family is going to be wiped out as a bloodline because of a conflict, your commitment and support to that may not be quite the same if you had many sons and daughters. And I think that's a factor that will contribute to the domestic legitimacy of any conflict and would figure in the war game. It must figure.
Yeah, and even just the demographic trend as the years go on, who do you draw upon for your armed forces? You have a diminishing population to draw upon. I mean, you can say, okay, we'll take women or we'll extend the retirement age of current serving members of the armed forces, but eventually demographics just are the reality. It was pointed out to me last week in Taiwan that this will be the first, if there is a war with China, it will be the first war fought with a country that has such a policy where the families of the forces will only have that member of the family as their next generation, and that, as you say, could factor into the will of the people to be part of something that seems to be limitless. There needs to be grand narrative for the Chinese people to be prepared to give up their bloodline, as you said. It reminds me of the Menzies family in World War I. They had 4 living children, 3 boys and a girl. Robert Menzies was the 3rd child. He had 2 older brothers. The family got around the table when deciding what to do about the family's commitment to the war effort, and Robert Menzies' parents, James and Kate Menzies, decided that the 2 older brothers would go and serve in World War I, but Bob would stay at home with his sister because Bob was the smart one and he was most likely to make the most money and look after the parents if Frank and Les didn't come home. So if you've only got one child.
It's an excellent example. And
very difficult, different situation.
And he paid a big political price for that. When he was the state member for Nunawading, I think it was, there was protests against him for that. And that was hard for him because it was a family decision and a rational one, and his family had given so much. But he weathered that, and I think it was something when I read about it, because he originally signed up to Melbourne University Regiment.
Yes.
And he was a member of the militia. And so if it wasn't for that decision, almost certainly would have gone and had put his hand up to make that. But it was a family decision, you're right, and he stood by his family as well.
Keith, thank you very much for your time today on the Afternoon Light podcast. It's been a fascinating discussion, a lot of very, I guess, concerning times ahead of us, some big decisions to be made, not just by the Defence Department, the Defence Minister, but I think consideration by our whole nation about the direction we go in and what we're prepared to put on the line for our freedom. But always good to chat to you, Keith, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.